Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. An exciting Saturday at the Miami Grand Prix once again delivers plenty of thrilling stories both on and off the track. And I admit at this point that the exciting stories at the front are relatively few and far between. Max Verstappen is mainly responsible for this. You simply have to bow down to his performance. Best time in practice, sprint pole, sprint win, pole for the Grand Prix. All the performances almost get a little lost among the other exciting stories, but at this point it should be said that we bow down to this performance, and normally we do the same for Fernando Alonso. Lately, however, things have been a bit of a mess. Whenever there's something to discuss, controversial situations, he's right in the middle of it, as was the case in the sprint to the Miami Grand Prix. You can have a great debate about whether Fernando Alonso was mainly responsible for his teammate Lance Stroll crashing into Lando Norris, or whether Lewis Hamilton was more to blame. The stewards also took a closer look at the accident at the start, and they said, well, nobody was really to blame, neither Fernando Alonso nor Lewis Hamilton. There were various chain reactions, but we can't really tell whether it was Alonso's fault or Lewis Hamilton's fault. If you take a really close look at the onboards, you can see that Fernando Alonso touches his own teammate before Lewis Hamilton comes in like a bull, as Fernando Alonso himself said on the radio. So it looks like he's also one of the main culprit, if you like, as if he had shot down his teammate who then turned in and crashed into the McLaren of Lando Norris. But if you listen to Fernando Alonso's comments, well, then it makes a bit more sense why he was relatively angry at the end. Yes, he says, well, he saw Lewis Hamilton come in on the inside and had to open up the steering so that the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton could not drive into him and crash. If you look at the onboards after these comments, you can actually see that Fernando Alonso always looks to the right, always to the right where Lewis Hamilton is coming. And if you look at the Hamilton onboard, you can clearly see that he is much too late. What Alonso is doing is still very, very harmless, so you can definitely discuss it. Two culprits can be identified. Perhaps there is one main culprit who should have been penalized, but the stewards were surprisingly quick at this point and said, no penalty, everything is okay. And that was very, very early on in the race. We waited for hours today for the stewards' decisions, actually for days if you add the right of review. The whole story also applied to Fernando Alonso. Alonso versus Sainz from the sprint in China was still being watched. The hearing was actually yesterday morning, then we waited almost 2 days, and in the end there was new evidence, but it was not significant enough, so the case around Fernando Alonso was not reopened. In the end, it did not matter anyway because it was not really about much. Now back to today's sprint, it's confusing, and Fernando Alonso has complained that Lewis Hamilton did not get a penalty for the action at the start. He says that if he would have done that, he would get a penalty for that. And he also has a reason why he would have received a penalty and Lewis Hamilton would not. He makes nationality the decisive factor in how the stewards judge cases. It's not the first time Fernando Alonso has said something like that. He often says that the British have the advantage with the stewards. He says that we Spaniards might have it a bit more difficult, and that's why he wants to talk to the FIA president, Mohammed bin Sulayem. He was also seen with him at the track on Saturday evening. He said that he just wants to make sure that his compatriots, that there are no disadvantages for any young Spaniards, that they are not judged differently. It is a topic where I would say I do not really have it on my mind. I do not see any different assessment based on nationality, whether if someone is British or Spanish. Perhaps the one or other pilot is seen a little more difficult by the stewards. Maybe they know that one or the other uses other methods. I would not really focus on Fernando Alonso specifically now, but I would not emphasize that this is because of his nationality. We must not forget that Fernando Alonso wants to talk to the FIA president about this. The FIA itself does not make any decisions. It appoints stewards, but the stewards are independent. They are not paid by the FIA. They only get a small expense allowance and then they judge. And this is usually a panel of stewards consisting of a chairman, a driver steward, a local steward, and then an additional one, i.e. a fourth one. And they are usually of very different nationalities. The British are there now and they really have the upper hand. So that's why I can't really understand what Fernando Alonso means with the point, but with the penalty. There's definitely room for discussion. I'm curious to hear what you say. Should Lewis Hamilton have been penalized? Should Hamilton and Alonso perhaps have been penalized because Landon Norris and Lance Stroll had no involvement in the situation at all? That should be clear to everyone, especially for Norris, of course, who was fined 25 euros in the end for getting out of his car and walking across the track without permission. We already know this from Lewis Hamilton from Qatar last year, 25,000 euros to pay now and then another 25,000 euros for probation. That was one thing when it came to the stewards and controversial situations. But then there was plenty more. And the sprint race started at 12 o'clock at 2015, which is local time. We had the final result. We had to wait for hours. And mainly because of fellow athlete Kevin Magnussen. I'm sure you have all noticed that he was a bit out of line. He managed to pick up a total of four penalties in one sprint race. When he accumulated 35 seconds, and those four penalties, he picked them up between lap 8 and lap 14. So that should probably be a record. I don't know if there are any statistics on that. What was going on? First of all, he got off to a great start, benefiting from the collision and the mess. The two Haas cars came out of the start lap in 7th and 8th position. Then there was a restart, 7th Hülkenberg, 8th Magnussen, 9th Hamilton. Then it was clear that Magnussen had to defend against Hamilton. He looked faster. Yes, and he did that with everything he had at his disposal. On lap 8, Kevin Magnussen simply shortened the chicane so that Lewis Hamilton could not overtake him. There was a 10-second penalty for this. On lap 11, he then left the track in turn 11 to regain position against Lewis Hamilton. Another 10 seconds on top. Turn 11 again on lap 14. It wasn't necessarily the fact that he left the track, but the duel against Lewis Hamilton, who he gave little room to steer, that got in the way. Another 10-second penalty. At the same time, this was his third track limit infringement, or his fourth, after he had already been given the black and white flag. So another 5 seconds on top of that. Yes, there was a lot going on. It's also important to know that he didn't get all these penalties immediately. The stewards have to look at it. In this case, they actually always ruled relatively quickly. But he only received the first penalty when he had already committed the second offense. That's not entirely insignificant, because there was an argument afterwards about whether he should have been allowed to drive like that, whether he should have been allowed to defend his position like that. Even though he'd actually already had a penalty from before, it's almost a philosophical question, so let's talk about it a bit more. Why did Kevin Magnussen defend himself so vehemently, even though he had already received the penalty at some point and knew that nothing was really at stake for him? He says he was protecting Nico Hülkenberg. Nico Hülkenberg was driving in front of him. We saw something similar in Jeddah when he got a penalty. It wasn't really about anything for him, but Hülkenberg was in front of him and he had to pull out a lead on Magnussen and the group behind Magnussen in order to be able to make a pit stop. In that case, it wasn't about the pit stop, it was just about making sure that nobody could overtake Hülkenberg. But was Magnussen really protecting Nico Hülkenberg? I actually dare to doubt it. I think it was almost a bit of an excuse on his part, because if you listen to the pit radio, you hear, well, why isn't Nico giving me DRS? So he didn't want to hold up the group behind him so that they could get to Nico Hülkenberg. No, he wanted to have DRS from Hülkenberg so that he could defend himself better towards the rear. And that's why I think it was a bit of an excuse. In the end, Nico Hülkenberg also said, well, I was the faster one. He had a bit more tire degradation, and that's why he had to let go. What Kevin Magnussen said there was not entirely insignificant, because the whole thing was later repeated for the stewards. They were all decisions that were made during the race, so these 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds. For the last 10-second penalty, they also decided to add 3 penalty points. Actually, there are no such points for such offenses. But then we said, wait a minute, we have a certain amount of discretion, and if certain factors come into play, then we can give penalty points. And then they said, wait a minute, for the third action, if you do that for the third time in a row, then there have to be some other consequences. So that's why 35 seconds penalty in 19 laps, 3 penalty points, we finished last in the end. But it does not matter in the end. There was another hearing. The stewards accused him of unsportsmanlike conduct. And that's why Kevin Magnussen had to answer to the stewards. And the stewards said, well, we heard your comments in the media. You obviously defended your teammate, and that was then discussed. Kevin Magnussen then admitted it again to the stewards. Yes, I had to defend myself. I do not like it. He also said that in the TV interviews, but teamwork, we scored points again. It turned out well for Nico Hülkenberg, who finished 7th. The stewards said it was a very difficult situation. We do not really agree with this driving style of Kevin Magnussen. We don't think what was done there was good. But on the other hand, unsportsmanlike conduct is obviously a tough accusation to make, and somehow it wasn't quite that bad. I think Kevin Magnussen gave an interesting explanation. He said, well, so far there is nothing in the regulations that would say that you no longer have to defend yourself from a certain penalty, that you have to drive differently. That's true, of course. And then the next person comes along and says, well, at what point is it no longer worth defending yourself? At what point is a penalty bad enough? And so on. So he did not know about all the penalties when he was driving like that. It was a difficult matter, but not everyone saw it the same way as the stewards at the time. There were certainly voices in the paddock who said, well, that wasn't okay, what Kevin Magnussen did there. That was way over the limit. Of course, he also ruined the race for Lewis Hamilton. Well, he was also penalized, but that's another matter. He messed up Lewis Hamilton's race, possibly also interfered with his race a bit because the competition got much closer due to this blockade and so on. And Andrea Stella, who is the McLaren team boss, even said that perhaps it would not do Kevin Magnussen any harm if he had to sit at home for a race and watch, i.e. towards a race ban. There are penalty points. We have already said that he's had 3. He's now at 8, and 12 points means a race ban. Yes, the steward's decision, I'm sure we'll talk about that with our expert Christian Danner in the AVD Motorsport-Magazin after the race weekend. Don't forget to ask us your questions under the hashtag AskAVD, and we'll talk about it again with our expert Christian Danner. And there isn't always room for all your questions. They don't even have room in our print edition, but we have answered some very interesting questions from you in the print edition together with Christian Danner, which we didn't have room for in the video format. So if you want to read what Christian Danner thinks, for example, about whether Toto Wolff is counted out at Mercedes, whether Mercedes might need another team boss, you can get this print edition, abo.motorsportmagazine.com. Yes, Mercedes is a good keyword, because the Mercedes crisis is somehow getting worse and worse. Only 11th and 12th positions in qualifying for the sprint yesterday. In the sprint, as we mentioned, Lewis Hamilton was more of a Skittles player at the start than a racing driver. Nevertheless, he was still somehow doing quite well in the race until he bumped into Kevin Magnussen, and everything that happened there happened. In the end, he then also got Magnussen. Yuki Tsunoda got past in the meantime because he was driven into them in this duel. Hamilton overtook again at the end and finished 8th, but was not allowed to keep this 8th place because he was given a drive-through penalty, i.e. 20 seconds. Why? Because he was much too fast in the pit lane. When the safety car was out, all the drivers had to drive through the pit lane. Of course, the normal speed limit applies, but Hamilton didn't stick to it. Quite a strange situation. Unfortunately, he wasn't asked what exactly was going on. We obviously watched the scene, and you can see that he slows down in the pits as he passes his mechanics because he wants them to have a look at his car to see if everything is okay after the collision at the start. Then he slows down and then accelerates. Although he obviously has the speed limiter on, he shifts up several gears, and normally the speed limiter is linked to an engine speed and thus maintains the speed. If you are then in the wrong gear, you are also at the wrong speed, and we don't have confirmation, but I would assume from the footage that Hamilton was well over the speed limit because of that. That was at the speed limit of about 90.7 kilometers per hour. That's why there's not a 5-second penalty, as is often the case for a minor offense, but for such sums, well, then there's the drive-through penalty. In qualifying for the Grand Prix, things went a little better for Mercedes with 7th and 8th positions. But, of course, that you can't be satisfied with that at all, especially as things looked a bit better in Q2. Lewis Hamilton was even in 3rd position, 0.4 of a second faster than in the decisive Q3. What was going on there? The Mercedes was once again unpredictable, although we've seen that with a lot of cars this weekend. The soft tires are difficult to understand. The track is also a bit tricky. The tires overheat. Sometimes it works in the first sector, but not in the last sector, or vice versa. So it's a bit complicated, but one person has the solution, namely George Russell. He has now said that we know what's going on, we're not lost. So he contradicts our title theme, Lost in Space, a bit, without probably having read it. He says we know what we have to do. Well, 2 weeks ago he said we absolutely need downforce, that's the only thing that will help us. Now he says our problem is that we've overcompensated from last year. Last year we had a very nervous rear end, which we then tried to compensate for or somehow get out of this car, and now we have understeer, and that's the problem. I'm curious to see what explanation Mercedes will come up with in the next few weeks, and it certainly seems pretty desperate. You might think that Red Bull Racing is also pretty desperate after what has happened so far this year and with the departure of their designer Adrian Newey, but no, the exact opposite is the case. Red Bull's managing director sport, Oliver Mintzlaff, has now opened up, and he doesn't really do that often. He gave a detailed interview to his colleagues in the Bild am Sonntag newspaper, and of course he addressed the issue that has been in the air and around Red Bull Racing for some time now. Max Verstappen, will he leave Red Bull Racing, yes or no? Toto Wolff always fuels these rumors a little. He says to Toto Wolff that it is not right to talk about other people's personnel like that, and that also has something to do with respect. So Toto Wolff and Oliver Mintzlaff seem to no longer get on particularly well, but Mintzlaff understands that Toto Wolff may be feeling a bit of pressure after years of driving behind Red Bull. Yes, what's next for Max Verstappen? Mintzlaff also has a clear opinion on this. He says that Verstappen has not said a word that he will not fulfill his contract, and that the contract runs until the end of 2028, and Mintzlaff himself is not even remotely worried that he is flirting with a change. So Max Verstappen is flirting with a move. And then, of course, there was also the elephant in the room, Christian Horner. There was the meeting in Saudi Arabia, the crisis meeting. You may all know the pictures. He says, no, Christian Horner is a very good CEO, i.e. managing director of Red Bull Racing, and he believes that we can continue to be successful with him in the future. So Red Bull Racing is now trying to iron out everything that has gone wrong in recent months. I'm curious to see how long they can keep up this facade, because you can see that it's still bubbling away. Maybe Adrian Newey really is just the first domino, as Zak Brown, the team boss of McLaren, said yesterday. You can hear others in the team flirting with a change. Yes, Red Bull, at least not a problem child in sporting terms, but we have discussed sporting problem children in more detail on our talk channel. Over on this talk couch, if you don't know our talk channel yet, feel free to take a look. It's still a relatively new channel. Here on this channel, we may soon reach 215.0. Over there, it's still very young. There are no hard facts, although there are hard facts from time to time. But there are discussions, opinions are exchanged about the problem children of Formula One, among other things, but most recently also about a possible new point system. Whether it wouldn't make more sense if there were points not just for the top 10 or if the whole thing should be expanded. So have a look over there, especially at the weekend if you want to pass the time a bit. Go now. Let's get a good night's sleep, and then we can look forward to the Miami Grand Prix. It's all set, perhaps a little closer for Leclerc than it initially seemed. He's getting his hopes up. I hope he's right and that we see an exciting Grand Prix.